To wrap it up now with one last panel, we're going to be hearing from Deborah Zarin, who's going to be talking about what the law requires versus what is actually being done at clinicaltrials.gov.
So, current status of efforts to enhance information about clinical trials. I guess to answer the question, how can we ensure or avoid waste and et cetera, the first thing is to make sure you have a list of clinical trials, or to put another way, end secret human experimentation, to quote Rob Califf, now Deputy Commissioner of the FDA. So let's see how we're doing with that. Let's see. Aha, okay. So what were some of the initial goals of trial registration? They were certainly to help potential participants find trials, but also to improve the scientific integrity of trial reporting. And key problems were really that we lived in, and we still live really in a system in which sponsors, investigators choose whether, when, and how to publish their study results. And it results in selective publication or missing trials, selective outcome measure and adverse event reporting, and unacknowledged protocol deviations. So we're all sort of aware of these problems. So what does clinicaltrials.gov consist of? And then I'll get into sort of trying to answer the question of how we're doing. The registry, what we call the registry part, has key protocol details. This is supposed to be a list of trials that are completed, that are ongoing. So it has the key protocol details, recruitment information, administrative information, and it's expected to be updated throughout the trial life cycle. So a trial starts, it's recruiting, and then it completes, et cetera. But in 2008, in response to a federal law, a results database was added to clinicaltrials.gov. So it used to just have a list of trials, and now it has results for, I think, over 18,000 trials at this point, which is really just a set of data tables. There's no recommendations, no conclusions, just simply the facts is what's supposed to be there. So the reasons I sort of went over, but there's human subjects protection reasons. Consider, for example, this drives me crazy, but most IRBs, in my experience, don't use clinicaltrials.gov. But how can you possibly evaluate the appropriateness of a new study or really the risks and benefits if you have no idea if you have access to the data that already exists about that intervention and condition? Issues about research integrity, informing evidence-based medicine and allocation of resources. For example, the NIH deciding whether to do a new study certainly should consider both what studies have been completed, whether or not they've been published, because we know that up to a third have never been published, but also, for example, why start a study of 300 people if there's a study that's about to complete somewhere else in the world of 3,000 people that happens to be addressing the same question? So that's the kind of thing you'd want to know before you decide what to do next. So these are there's basically, currently there's 3 key policies I'll talk about. FDAA, which is the federal law, it stands for Food Drug Administration Amendments Act, addresses registration and results reporting, and it's for certain trials that involve drugs or devices that are regulated by the FDA. It excludes phase 1, and it has significant penalties for noncompliance. Going further over to the right, the ICMJE, I should have put these in time order, established a policy. These are the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors in 2005, saying you had to register your trial in order to be eligible for publication. So they're talking about registration, and that's probably had the biggest impact of any of these policies. And then in the middle, NIH recently, back in the fall, announced a draft or proposed rule which would essentially extend FDAA, so beyond just drug and device trials, but to any trial that's funded by NIH. So it would address both registration and results reporting. So how are we doing? So FDAA exists, the ICMJE policy exists, other policies exist. The NIH policy is not yet in place. So the question is, how is this all working? So the glass is half full. I'm trying to be an optimist here. There's a lot of policies beyond the ones that I just talked about. At the bottom, you could see that CMS has a policy about trial registration for coverage of the routine care costs associated with being in a clinical trial, and with their coverage for evidence development studies. The VA has a policy requiring all trials that they fund to be registered and the results reporting. PCORI now has a similar policy, and then I just talked about the NIH proposed policy. So there's a lot of policies being piled on that are adding to the existing law, okay? That seems good. We're getting more and more submissions, so we're getting over 500 new trials registered per week from around the world. We now have almost 200,000 trials in our database. The results reporting section is getting bigger with almost 18,000 records, and a lot of people seem to use the site. So that all seems good. People are doing research and are showing that our results section in particular has better data frequently than the Associated Journal publications. So that seems good. So far we're doing good. This is an interesting graph that we just published, but it's sort of showing each bar is an academic medical center, and the vertical axis is the percentage of the studies that they sponsor that come under a trial reporting policy. So you could see up at to the far right, there are organizations where almost every trial that they sponsor now has to report results to clinicaltrials.gov. The median, I think, is about 60%. So meaning that at this point, I would like to argue that we've reached a tipping point, that people who run academic medical centers can no longer pretend that these policies don't exist, and maybe they need to set up structures to help their investigators fulfill their obligations. So that seems good. And then we've been studying other questions, like how do you study whether this has helped with publication bias? We recently defined 100 drug families. These are 100 recently approved drugs, and we found that large percentage, I'm not going to go into the detail, have information that's only available in clinicaltrials.gov. So in other words, these are newly approved drugs. Where can you find evidence about the results of those clinical trials that inform the FDA decisions? And what we're seeing is that clinicaltrials.gov is certainly contributing to it. So for example, 123 trials from 43 of the drug families only have information in clinicaltrials.gov. Meaning if clinicaltrials.gov wasn't there and you were dependent only on PubMed or the literature, you wouldn't know anything about 43 of those drug families. You wouldn't know the trials existed. There would be no data until the FDA ended up posting the results on their website. But 20 drug families, by the way, so 20 out of 100, have no data on results anywhere. Not in clinicaltrials.gov, not in PubMed. So we're not there yet. We don't have information in the public domain about everything that's out there. I'm going to skip the rest just to get to the glass half empty part. So there's ongoing skepticism about trial registration, even among journal editors. This was Liz Wager presented this at the Peer Review Congress a year or two ago, and basically quoted all these editors of journals, not the very top journals that are part of the ICMJE, but journals where a lot of trials are published, saying, it's not worth it. Why would I do that? Why would I ask people to register their trial? It's too depressing to read them, but you'll see the slides later. We also look at, it's very hard when people say, is everyone registering their trial? Because there's no alternative list of trials to compare it to, right? That's the point. So we recently started looking at late registrations, meaning registrations 3 or more months after the study start date. Because thinking if you're registering a lot of studies late, it means there are not systems in place at your sponsoring organization to ensure that you've registered. And you could see that industry has about, 27% of their studies were registered late. This is in 2014. NIH-funded studies, about 20%, 21%. Others a little bit higher. And this is a graph of NIH-funded trials over the years. And there's a long tail, so every year there's a whole bunch of studies being registered more than 12 months late. So this is a few hundred studies being registered very late, which my guess means that there's a few hundred studies that are never registered, because it's hard to know what the precipitant is to register 2 years late, but it probably has something to do with publication. And since we know a lot of things are never published, so this just seems like a problem. And then we know there are mixed but overall low rates of results reporting. This is our data from 2014, trying to basically model compliance with FDA. So if you were fully compliant with FDA, this is NIH funded, industry and other, and we're seeing that NIH has nearly 50% compliance, industry a little over 60% compliance, but nobody is up near 100% compliance. But those means reflect a lot of heterogeneity, actually, among the different sponsors. This is an anonymized list of institutions. These are the top 10 NIH grant recipients. And you can see that one, number 5, has 88% compliance, and another one, number 10, has only 9% compliance. I will say that the institution that represents number 10 is now up to 19%. Nevertheless, when I showed this recently at a training conference we were holding, 5 different people in the audience came up worried that their institution was number 10. So this is like, just feels like Don Berwick speaking, but basically this is a very effective intervention. You know, you could send out, we're trying to get the powers that be to send out letters to institutions where you could literally just show them the distribution across all academic medical centers and just give them their own institution's data. And we think that might be quite powerful. But what this shows you is that some institutions are taking it a little bit more seriously than others. Drug companies, same situation, although never skews that low. You know, there are many organizations that are up in very high compliance and some not so high. Device companies, I keep forgetting to remove line number 9. They have no clinical trials, so they're not compliant. But basically, device companies are all over the map, and in general, less compliant than drug companies. There was just recently this report out of Duke, Monique Anderson, where she reviewed many of these same data. There's also poor quality reporting, which I'll skip this one. Steve Goodman has seen this. This is basically people come to register their study and they can't tell us how many arms are in the study. When they come to enter results, they say they registered this, in this example, they registered it as 1 arm, but the eligibility criteria referred to 3 arms. In the results database, they first talked about 2 arms, and then they had a secondary outcome measure with 3 other arms. Basically, we finally got a hold of the protocol, and we're able to see that it was a 6-armed study. And so my staff could easily describe this study, and yet the PI of a New England Journal published paper could not come and tell us, this is the study. It has 6 arms, this is what we're doing, this is what we're measuring. This interferes with high quality data. There have been 2 main papers, the Hartung paper I was involved with, and then the Becker paper, it was out of Yale, comparing results entries in clinicaltrials.gov with associated publication for the same trial, and you see some discrepancies. So POM stands for primary outcome measure. The description was discrepant about 15% of the time, but the actual value was discrepant 20% in our study and 16% of the time, meaning if your primary outcome measure was, say, change in systolic blood pressure at 3 months, and one source said it was 8 millimeters of mercury, and the other source might have said it was 15 millimeters of mercury. So that raises questions. If literally you cannot report the same summary statistic in the same way in 2 places, it actually raises questions about the accuracy or veracity of either source, right? It could be that one's correct and the other's wrong. It could be that neither are correct. Then finally, clinicaltrials.gov is a tool in it, and in some ways it only helps if editors use it. So this was an editorial from Annals of Internal Medicine that I wrote with a colleague, where basically they had published 2 papers that, this is an example of one of them, that readers had subsequently complained about because in the publication, the primary outcome measure was different than what was listed in clinicaltrials.gov. So on the one hand, this could be glass half full because we empowered the reader. The reader could see there was a discrepancy. In this case, it's changed from the HAM-D to the MADRS as 2 different measures of depression, and the timing changed actually as well. On the other hand, the editor hadn't checked that, so this was not yet valued by the editorial staff, right? We've also heard from wandering around academic medical centers, FDA will never be enforced, it's a waste of time, and the usual, we always publish all our data. Everyone publishes all their data except for 1/3 of the people who don't. So, but we've never met those 1/3, so we don't know where they lurk. Okay? So then you're all hearing about individual participant level data, and I'm just putting that in there to say that one of the reasons it's of interest, so you go from collecting the data over on the left, uncoded, then you're making all these arrows represent decisions, ideally guided by a pre-specified protocol, but inevitably some are subjective decisions to clean and code it, and eventually you're reporting that summary data. That's what goes into clinicaltrials.gov, that's what goes into journal articles. But one of the interests in participant level data is to basically enable an audit trail, as well as to do other kinds of meta-analyses and subgroup, other kinds of detailed analyses that you can't do with just the summary data. And we, by the way, think clinicaltrials.gov, which does not host participant level data, would be a good sort of overarching framework for finding the data. What we don't want is for that to provide a new kind of publication bias. So everyone goes to the shiny object. So, oh, here's a trial, and we have the participant level data. Let's pay attention to that, ignoring the fact that there are 5 other trials on the same topic that don't have participant level data and maybe don't even have summary results. But what I want to say is that it's a scientific and ethical imperative to ensure the timely reporting of all human experiments, and that clinicaltrials.gov provides that. And what we have to do is make sure that trial sponsors stick to their commitment, their ethical and scientific commitment. And I will, so the question is, will the culture change? Will this become an absolute imperative at every sponsoring organization? So this is my chance to say that last summer I was at Martha's Vineyard, and I'm going back tomorrow. And I was trying to find a place to rent a stand-up paddleboard. And I was told this place was just past the jumping bridge. And I didn't know what the jumping bridge was, but I was biking and I saw this. So I figured, that's the jumping bridge. So there it is. That seemed kind of cool. And then I got up close, and what it says is no jumping or diving from the bridge. Keep off the bridge rail. And by the way, it was a policeman who told me that the stand-up paddleboarding was right past the jumping bridge. So the question is, okay, it says, this doesn't seem to faze anyone, cars even honk in acknowledgement, because everyone knows that it's a perfectly acceptable thing to do, okay, to jump off the jumping bridge in front of the no jumping off jumping bridge sign. And so the question is, will these trial disclosure things be jumping bridge rules, or will they be actually enforced rules? And time will tell. So I'll end there. So it's like.